okay with that. So get rid of that. All that, got it. So look, for those who don't know, my background is I trained as a psychologist. I then went and joined Sarches and went to Gray, where I first started as an account man. Then I moved over to being a strategic planner. And I left the advertising world realistically about 2006. I spent the rest of the time really as a trainer. And I've got an MBA and various other masters, and I'm currently training as a psychotherapist as well now. So quite a sort of eclectic mix of experiences. One of the things I've been doing over the years is basically reading books, summarizing them for other people, and basically sort of Judy and I, are long-term friends, and basically she sort of suggested I sort of did a couple of these, so I'm very happy to help out. And the book I've decided to look at today, which may you feel is to be on the edge of what you're doing, because anyone who's read this or looked at it may think, oh, it's this whole big boost into empiricism and data, and but actually I think the book actually fundamentally brings two major things to the marketing, the field that you are sort of very closely aligned to, which is this whole field about lean and agile, which you may have heard, and the principles of that. But it's also very much about recognizing that, consumer experience sits in the very heart of actually developing and honing what a product is about. But I thought we'd share this just to go and start with, for anyone who's seen this film. It is about Moneyball. And basically it was this idea about how data started to change how sport was actually run. And in many ways, how marketing these days, we can't turn our eye away from the fact that data is very much the very heart of what marketing is. So, I think, what that did is that the story of that did start to change the way the sport is now, organized. And I think that we are facing a new world of marketing, where in marketing terms, we are seeing much greater access towards data. Actually, you could argue too much data, and that's confusing the hell out of us. But if I try to define this book in a nutshell, it's sort of, almost sort of counter to what we were talking last time about thinking fast and slow, which is saying, like, the trouble is we do make decisions emotionally very often. And actually saying the trouble is we therefore fall in love with our ideas. And because we fall in love with our ideas, we lose that objectivity, and we hold on to stuff, and we don't let go. We don't see it through the eyes of our consumers and say, no, what we've got to do, we have got to be much more rational, much more objectified within our decision making if we really want to do what's right. And therefore, what actually the book is suggesting is what we've got to do is park our own emotional biases and stick with information driven by consumers, which isn't just data, but is driven by them to make better quality decisions. And we must stick by what they think and not by what we think, because we are misguided by that. Now, certain egotistical CMOs or CEOs may think differently, but actually that is the essence of what the book is about. So it's about a process of iterating your way through to a better quality product through learnings, through a whole series of hypotheses and testing. So a very scientific approach to it. So some of the key premises is, the fact that I was just saying, we are blinded by our ideas, and we fall in love with them. And basically, the reality is that we've got to be more humble, that the other people see the world differently. They've got different experiences in life, and they don't see it quite the way that we are. And we've got to let go of that stuff. And the reason why that so many products fail, including startups fail, is because we don't have the objectivity. We fall in love with our own ideas. And the other thing talked about in the book is the idea about knowledge is really more important than money. What you do is you must focus upon getting a lot of understanding upon how to iterate your way to develop a powerful product. And only when you've got a powerful product do you put money behind it. So knowledge is more important than money at the start. And therefore, research sits at the very heart of product development. Knowledge is king in this way. And therefore, to go back to that theme of the verse, is emotionally detached decision-making is what they're trying to say we've got to be doing, using empirical evidence, driven by end consumers, end users of the products, which, as you'll see later on, can be through sort of ethnographics, as it can be through data. And it's all focused on iterating, because very often the final product is nowhere near the first idea that first came out. So we've got to iterate our way through slow micro changes along the way. And as is true with the whole principle of lean and agile, is this idea about you've got to cut out waste. We've got to focus on the important. And then what we can then do is we don't waste time, we don't waste money, we can move ahead with greater certainty and greater speed. And this whole idea about learn fast, fail fast. So there's some other key principles, and we've all heard that quote from David Ogilvy on the right-hand side, but it is this whole idea about we've got to validate our learnings through continual testing. So it's not like we'll do a bit of sort of research, then we'll do it. No, the whole principle seems to be like you test, you test, you test, you test, you test. And what they do is they almost say, like, what we have is we set up experiments on a continual basis. We have a hypothesis. So anyone who's done science knows that you basically have a hypothesis. You then test that, as we take the old sort of famous book, the sort of Hedges book about testing to destruction. And we try to prove it by disproving it, is where the principles come from. And therefore, what we do is we use empirical evidence, and that may not just be data to remove the emotional bias that we live in. And they sort of say in the book very much about we set hard go, no-go benchmarks, metrics. If it doesn't hit it, there's no, oh, well, maybe let's see next time. No, it failed, move on. Now, we'll criticize that a bit later on, but we'll come back to that. And this whole thing about learning from real user experience, because the way they will use it, the way they interact with it is not the way that we think they will. Yeah, and we've all learned that, we've all seen that. And then they talk, they're very much principle about the minimal viable product. You've got to get it in people's hands, you've got that concreteness. We've all heard that quote about, a picture's worth 1,000 words, and James Dyson said, and a prototype is worth 1,000,000 words. And they got this idea that we make a decision at every single point, upon that is we've got that go, no go, that pivot or proceed. Do we keep going? No, we've got to change. Do we keep going? Do we change? Do we change? And so it's those micro decisions that the product incrementally moves forward. So it's not about evolution. So it's not about revolution. It's an evolutionary process of how we're just inching the product forward. So let's move on to some of the key themes they talk about. Obviously, at the very heart of what lean and agile and scrum and all these other words that really started in the world of software development comes from is this idea about, one of the key things is we've got to identify what adds value and what is just waste. And anyone who's done an MBA will know about Michael Porter talks about the added value chain. Where in the organization are you adding value? And we've got to work out, where do we add value? What are people really buying? What do they really like? And therefore, what will they pay good money for? And then we've actually got to look at what are the things that are draining the value away? What's actually stealing it? What's stealing our value? What's stealing our time? And it therefore means that we are able to more focus where our resources are played. And again, it's quite hard-nosed, like, if it ain't working, cut it. If you've done that bit of code, it ain't working, or you've got that feature, cut it, get rid of it. I know on the left-hand side, it's not in the book, but it's like the 7 classic, wastes of lean, where we actually put too much money or too many resources, and we need to get those out of the system. And again, it's like you'll test your way to knowledge. So basically, test, fail, go for failure, accept failure, very much part of it, and learn from that. We've all heard that many times before. And they quote an example in the book about TurboTax, about they did 500 iterations a month. you know. And what was very good about that is, you know, you spend so much time in meetings debating about, well, we've got limited resources, what do we test? You've all done that with concept development. You know, the client wants to test 25 different concepts. Well, you don't have time, you can put in 7 or 10. So now they're debating forever which are the ones that go in. Well, if you're doing 500 tests a month, you know, anyone's idea can go in, so you don't waste time, you know, and therefore, you know, comes a much more sort of democratic sort of space into. And they talk about, actually, if you do this constant testing, you can develop within 1 year something that would have taken 5 years otherwise. And obviously, we know speed to market is critical, you know, and, you know, where is the new competitive edge? And this idea about value times growth, and they talk about, does the product add real value to the consumer? So people think, oh, this is a great product, I would really buy it. But actually, the world doesn't want to buy it. The world is not interested in that stuff. So we've really got to get very quickly in touch with what do they think is of value in this product you're doing. And they talk in the book quite a few examples about where people actually bought something different about it. They thought that was of value, not that bit. So is that getting to really understand what consumers really like, and therefore what is the bit they will pay money for, and therefore that's what you focus on. And they talk about how far and how fast can the product be scaled for growth, you know, and, you know, in the book, they really sort of talk a lot about this idea about finding, you know, where is it that you can get the value from, and how do you get that growth, that idea about pivot and scale. I thought a very interesting thing they talked about is this idea about you don't want to buy artificial growth very early on through marketing, because as we've all seen in the past, you know, if you market something really well, you can start to get initial sales and you can boost it, but actually you don't get the repeat sales because basically the product was a dog and people only bought it just to go and try it. So they're saying, like, save your money, don't spend it early on, make sure you've really spent the time to get a really good quality product. And only then can you maximize your marketing budget, because then you're going to develop a product that really does give the opportunity for scale. And one of the other processes they talk about, which you've probably all done as well, is this process of the 5 whys. You know, and so they're sort of saying, like, sort of identify where your problem is, where's the block point. And so why did A happen? Well, A happened because of B. But you don't just stop at B, you say, well, why did B happen? Well, B happened because of C. And why did C happen? Because C happened because of et cetera, so you really get down to the fundamental problem, and you need to then address that, which therefore unlocks all the other things. And it talks in the book about how most people are not asking about the 5 whys, but the 5 whos. You know, who's to blame? You know, and we've got to basically try to change that culture of blame. And, you know, as everyone talks about these days, creating a culture where failure is seen as part of success. In the book, it talks a nice example about when they're developing this sort of minivan, the sort of Sienna, I think it was called. You know, the chief engineer basically took a road trip, you know, in the prototype minivan, and was driving around with his kids. And basically, you know, one of the big insights that what Genchi Kimbutsu, I can't pronounce it, so somebody may know better, you know, go see for yourself, which is like, you get real first-hand experience about this stuff. You know, talked about how, you know, minivans are chosen by the kids, not by the mum and dad. So actually, you know, if you put folding rear seats in and tray tables and internet, you know, connecting cables in the back, you know, the kids will love the car, and therefore they'll pester mum and dad to go and buy it. So therefore, recognizing that is a really important point. And I think actually, as we've all talked about, is that how do you get the client from behind the glass to being in front of the glass and really experience it for themselves, you know, creates a really much more, you know, experiential way in which they learn, rather than just reading a dull piece of research. In the book, it talks about the minimal viable product. And this goes back to that principle about, you know, as we've all heard about, if you know, what Ford said, you know, if I'd asked consumers, they just said they would just want a faster horse. And people don't know what they really want, but actually you need to have a tangible experience of something to really get the real powerful learnings about. So therefore, develop the minimal viable product, the very base, without you know, it's got warts and everything on it, it's not ideal, it's not done the perfect packaging, you know, it's a bit scruffy, but at the end of the day, people get to understand the fundamental of what you're trying to offer. And when they do that, you know, they sort of say, well, you know, that doesn't really do what I want it to do. I'm more interested in that than that. So it talks about develop the minimal viable product as quickly as you can, get in the hands of real consumers who want to test it out, and you'll learn so much more by doing that than you do by asking sort of conceptual questions, because as you probably know better than I do, consumers aren't necessarily great at thinking conceptually. And they talk about small batch size, and small batch size is very much this idea about, you know, if you do a small batch size, then you can iterate, you can change it quite quickly. You know, if you wait forever, they talk about this example about, you know, you've probably done those sort of, you've done mailers off to people where you put your brochure into an envelope, you stick it down, you put the stamp on, you're right, just send it off. And they're sort of saying that you don't want to be like sort of just doing the first part, we'll stuff the envelopes, because you may suddenly find that you bought a load of envelopes which have got a duff sticky bit. In which case they're making the point that you've really got to develop it totally all the way through with a small batch size first, and only then will you then really know what stuff is about, rather than waiting for the end. So it's about very early learnings as much as you can. So, and the other thing about small batch sizes is very much about, you know, increasingly the market is going in marketing towards personalization. You know what Nike are doing, where you can go and get the shoe designed perfectly for you, and saying that the more that we can tailor this to individuals, you know, I'll be doing another workshop. They talk about find your dot, this idea very much about, you know, be as very specific as possible. If we can be super precise and be able to develop something that is really perfectly designed for one person, you're more likely to sell it than if you're trying to sell something which is quite bland and you know, for lots of people. So really, like, design something that really is perfectly designed for your sister is a better approach than trying to design something you think, well, 1 million people will buy this. Find your dot is what the idea is about. And then again, he talks a lot about beware of vanity metrics, and we see this all the time, you know, in digital these days, that you can look at so many different metrics and you can fall in love. Well, you know, I got a Facebook like, but you know, what's that really mean? And we've really got to be like, no, the most important one we've got to look at. And I always say the answer lies in 5% of the data, not in the 95% that you've almost got to deliberately ignore a lot of that stuff. You've got to put the things out. This is what we're worried about. This is what we're looking at. These only numbers I'm going to look at, and shelve the rest, because they will only confuse you. And we all know about decision making becomes harder. The more information we bring, we get into data overload, and that basically confuses us rather than helps us. So work out up front, what is the important data we look at, and only look at that. They talk a lot about this idea about we're learning to pivot. You know, we either proceed or we pivot, so we change things. And I'm not going to go through these in any great depth, it'll be in the deck for you afterwards, but it's almost like 10 ways to pivot, you know, 10 ways in which you change things. And these are like basic fundamental sort of strategies anyway, you know, about, you know, how do you look at it differently? How do you find a new angle on what you're doing? You know, is what this is about. You know, lots of different ways. Do you find a different target audience? Do you focus on a different need? Do you focus bigger? Do you focus smaller? Do you find a different way of bringing it to market? Do you find a different way of actually financing it? You know, all those things are different ways of looking at it. So really just sort of criticisms of it is this sort of, you know, the lean startup process. You know, does it really suit all businesses? Clearly it was designed for new tech. Would it work for FMCG? You know, yes, in some ways and no in other ways, you know, but I think that, you know, to go and suggest that one model fits everyone, I think is actually naive in this current day and age. And likewise, you know, there is some debate in the book about this, about, so I just got the minimal viable product. The idea of a minimal viable product is that you put it out, warts and all, it's ill-developed, you then constantly are iterating, improving it. You're doing software upgrades, you're constantly upgrading it. But actually, you know, in the world of transparency, the world of mass communication we're hearing about, does that do more harm than good? Are people more going to be moaning about something? And are you better to go and wait? And one of the issues they say about actually, if you set it up right, all those early adopters like being the early adopters. They like being involved in the testing program. So as long as you set it up right, then basically that's fine. If you try and promise you've got all the answers sorted up front, well, then you're going to be absolutely slammed for it. But early adopters seem to quite like it, seem to be tolerant that it's in that beta stage of that stuff. And again, the other thing they talk a lot in the book about, you know, you set your metrics and you then set your hard numbers and then you have the no-go. Well, one of the problems I noticed, and I've done lots of sort of, you know, IPA and FE sort of effectiveness papers, is setting benchmarks is incredibly difficult. And it's really difficult even when you've got the data. But when you're working in a completely new space, you don't know what is good, what is a good number. You know, because actually benchmarks, on the fundamental benchmarks are basically, you know, reverse engineered. You go from past data, well, this is what happened in the past. This is what we did with that sort of budget. That's what consumers did. Yeah, that's what competitors did. If you're in a completely novel space, benchmarks are very difficult to know, is 10 good or bad? So really, that was it. That was all I really had to go and ask. So really, any questions, any sort of, you know, observations about that, you know, it'd be great just to open the debate up, because as much of this as we know, it's about the reflection and discussion that we learn from, rather than it is from me just whittering on about what someone said over 200 pages in the book. So any observations, comments about that?
I have a question, Paul. And it maybe links into that. You dropped in that you were training as a psychotherapist as well.
Yeah.
Which is a dilemma I've kind of faced with this particular technique on a couple of occasions, is that most entrepreneurs are actually massively opinionated. Naturally, they've got great egos, very healthy egos. Otherwise, they wouldn't be stupid enough to start a business and risk their house, right?
Yeah. And
so you've got a really interesting tension. So it's pretty rare to find, from my experience, to find an entrepreneur who's also a very rational animal, as it were, and therefore very open to this kind of approach. I'm just wondering if that kind of question made any sense.
Yeah, I think, you know, what I heard you say is, you know, because of the egotistical, I know I'm right attitude of many new business startups, you know, or even just CMOs, it's difficult for them to have the humility to think that another person may see it differently and that they could be wrong, because it would challenge who they fundamentally are. And I think you are right. You do raise a very good point. Actually, Chloe and I were talking about this just before we started this. And I, you know, from my own experience, you know, there's something about, you know, as much as possible, if they can actually hear another person for real talking, you know, there's something about how do you get them from behind the glass? How do you get them actually in front of a real person, or in there, you know, so all those, you know, accompanied shops, accompanied cleans, accompanied cooks, all those things you can organize where people have a real personal experience about it is much more powerful. Because as we know, if you turn information into a oral mode of it comes in through the ear, it then gets processed at a very rational level. And I will have a rational approach that I can knock that out of the way. If actually you deal with it coming through an emotional space, which is what a real person talking to you, and you sense and you have the transference of all the emotional space that's going on there, then actually that's a much more powerful space, and they're probably less able to go and counter that because it will create emotions in them, and as we know that. So I would, as much as possible, I did this, on one of my GSK clients, we were talking about something, and I happened to get, a couple who were wearing dentures, talking about life wearing dentures, because the client was very much still at a place about stereotypical attitudes toward people who wear dentures, and getting real consumers talking about it with them and just having a chat. Literally, it was in the office, they came in, we just chatted like normal human beings together, and that completely changed the way this client saw. And every now and again, he'd actually reference back to what Brenda said, very powerful stuff. So yeah, so thanks Ian for the question.
Thank you.
I had a question, Paul, thanks for that, that was really helpful. I had a question just about the minimal viable product, and it seems like it's about getting things in front of users, participants really early on. And I just wondered what that would consist of when it's at the really early stages. Would it just be sketches? Because you said we shouldn't be getting people to conceptualize things, it's putting something in front of them. So would that be a sketch, or would that be sort of getting it up into a mocked up product or something?
Yeah, I think, as close as you can is possible, but I know there is something about the physicality of picking something up into, even if it doesn't spray, but being able to get them there. There's a tangibleness about stuff which creates a completely different relationship than if it's just words on a paper. We are using a different form of assessing things if we come through that modality than if we come through another modality. So where possible, even if it's just a pack design, but let's just take the world that I worked in, toothpaste. You can get a very flat piece of paper and there's your beautiful pack. No, someone just have the common sense, fold it up, make it up into the square box. Just somehow that makes it even better. Now, very often we would have the product there and they would say, oh, you can't, no one can test this at all. But literally if they can just touch the tube, open it up, smell it a bit, then somehow that makes a lot of difference. So as close as possible you can, even if it's still just in a very dummy form. That's what they're saying. And they do say lots of examples in the book about, when Groupon was being done or something like that, there was another one, I don't know what it was. They showed a video, and basically showing a video got closest to it. But the more we can is possible.
Paul, do you remember when we used to do all that work with Oyvind, and we used to start people off with a concept, a sort of broad idea, demonstrate different ways that it could be executed, and then sort of almost ask them to build it themselves. So they'd envisage something, they'd draw it, they'd model it, they'd give it back to you. You'd then see how feasible that was, and then you bring another group of people in and they'd adapt that. Actually taking the lead from the consumer on adapting product and design and shape has always been sort of, a grey area, but I believed it got us miles further because it was a collaboration between the sort of conceivers of the idea and those who would use it at the other end.
And and I think that we were working with a great client then, who was a very sort of, he was very respectful of the kids, very, very sort of, he had a great degree of humility about him. So therefore his mindset, how he came into the project, allowed that to happen.
And he was always in the room.
He was always in the room. And there's something about, I can learn from these people versus certain people who are close. There's something about one of the very first things you've got to do, even before you start doing any research, is how do you open your client up? There is that step you need to be doing, which allows you to then let the work have its role and its place. And I think we were lucky that we had a client there. We've all had the clients, haven't we, who are, no, my way is the right way. I'm just doing a project right now with a person in the States, and she's got her view about what it is, and she ain't going to be changed. And therefore, you're sort of forced to say, well, okay, therefore we'll do it like that. The average won't work for you, but that's what you want. At some point, you've got to give up with it.
I was really one of the last points you made was around reputation and the fear of being seen to be providing a substandard product. And I've been working quite a bit with clients recently who are trying to be like startups, but they're big, massive corporations with multiple brands. And so although their ideation and creation phase can be quite nifty and full of pivots, they are really anxious about the point at which it's exposed to any consumers. And it makes the MVP process very hard, because actually they really don't want anything scruffy or anything that could come back and bite them. So they're sort of adapting half of the mindset quite successfully, but then getting really scared of the second half of the mindset, arguably the more important bit, where it's being exposed to real people.
Yeah, I think, there's something very interesting about, you think about all this stuff is absolutely countercultural to most organizations, particularly large ones, because most organizations, the unconscious paradigms which they run their business is about risk aversion. It's about taking last year's plans, iterating, improving by 5%. It's about adapting oldness rather than embracing newness. So actually, when you do new product development, when you do new category development, when you do new advertising, that basically fundamentally breaks all their fundamentals that they're doing. And therefore, when I used to work in the agency world, we said that our fundamental role as account people were to make clients feel it was safe. In many ways, why do we do research? Because it makes them feel safe. And I think, one's got to recognize that the cultural space that you're trying to drive decision making in, makes the stuff we're doing, they are not feeling safe. And when they don't feel safe, control comes in. They'll control and control and control until eventually they feel so unsafe, they will just literally absolutely take complete control of that. I saw it in the advertising world all the time. So in other words, what your job there is to make them feel safe as best as you can. That's my perception.
Yeah,
I had a question. Sorry, Gary.
okay.
So I'm worried this will make me sound a bit anti-research, but I guess one of the things I was thinking about after Ian talked about entrepreneurs was that a lot of them do have that quite strong vision, especially if it's quite an innovative new product. And I completely get why you'd want to test lots before you bring it into market. But is there something in not showing it to consumers at the very beginning? Like, could it potentially make the product more bland or more like everything else if you're bringing it in really early in the process when they're still being creative about it? I suppose, that's I'm thinking of some other products we've shown to people in the past, and people have responded against them because they're so new and they're just not used to them. So I was wondering what you thought about that.
Yeah, I think, to re-quote that Ford quote, Henry Ford quote, some of your concepts are so out there that they will not be able to have any conceptualization of it. That's why minimal viable product is the way, because then they can get it, they can understand, they can play with it, they can use it the way they want to. But, I think actually what great entrepreneurs are is at their very heart, they do learn to adapt. You think about in the old days, I don't know if they still do it, but Marks and Spencer used to use Baker Street as their testing zone. You went in there, you see a new microwave dish, you try it. If it worked, it went national. If it didn't work, it just disappeared. And I think there's something about the reality is, what an entrepreneur really is only concerned about is making money. And basically, if it makes money, they'll do it. If it doesn't make money, and I think, they will, the reality is that we talk these days about planning through action rather than planning in advance of action. So in other words, we don't do a lot of debate. We get it out there, we test it quickly, and then we iterate. And I think there's something like that's still another way of doing it. Many of these great entrepreneurs have probably failed 25 times before they made it big. But what they've learned is try it, drop it, try it, drop it, try it, drop it, you know, and all they're doing is we're trying to like reduce the risk on the big scale by bringing it to like smaller scale. But the same principles they had years ago is what, you know, the lean startup is about. And it's all about a hypothesis. They've got a hypothesis. I think this is a great product. You test it. Oh, my consumers didn't think it was great. Or maybe you test it with the wrong consumer group. Maybe there are a group who do think it's great, in which case you find them. Yeah, so yeah, that's what the pivot is. You pivot to find your way. You've got to inch it to, you know, it's like, you know, I've got some building work up there and I can see them putting the woods up and, you know, and they're moving it one side and tapping with a hammer. That's the metaphor, you know. Have I put it in the right place? Tip it over there, bash the hammer a bit, move it up there. Yeah. It's a rather odd metaphor, but it's just what's it.
We've got a couple of minutes left. Has anybody else got another question or observation that they want to make?
Hi, Paul. Sorry, Chloe. Yeah, thanks for that, Paul. I really enjoyed it. It's really useful. I had quite a specific question, that's why I left it towards the end. It's about when you're talking about metrics, vanity metrics, and I think that's really interesting. And I'm working a lot in the world of metrics and what's important and what you measure and why you do it. Was there any specifics about which ones are particularly vain and which ones to avoid? Or is it more about understanding, you know, case by case
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, go ahead.
One of the, you know, if I dump into the world of when I was doing lots of metrics on campaign evaluation, I'll say your metrics are clearly defined by your objectives. What were your objectives you were trying to go and do with that product, that campaign, that whatever? Those are the metrics. They're defined. Everything else is, you may need to have some metrics to demonstrate the consumer journey along the way. So we want to go from did they engage? Did they understand? Did they act? But actually, you know, fundamentally, often it's about were they aware of something? Have we changed their opinion on something? Have we changed their behavior on something? And they become the fundamentals we're often looking at. And therefore they become the metrics. So things like the one I always quote is dwell rate. Yeah. Oh, we've done this wonderful website and people are dwelling, they're staying on our site for so long. Well, frankly, that's irrelevant, because if you actually go and do it, and why I do love ethnography is because you get to see what people are really doing. You suddenly realize, no, why there's dwell rate? Because they wouldn't have made a cup of tea. They're sitting on the loo and the site's open. You're not really enjoying your site, or your site is so bloody impossible to get off of, they can't find how to get off it. So we can misunderstand what some things, and, you know, as we always said, you know, the one we always joke about is, what is a like? What's a share? You know, now a share is maybe more powerful than a like, because, but then, you know, frankly, you know, does it lead to any action? We need an action, you know, because we're not doing stuff just for the sake of just doing it. So therefore, I think it's very careful to look at this, and we've got to think, where does that metric really lead us to? And I think, you know, I've got sort of my of like, it's maximum five metrics. If you can't make up your mind on 5 metrics, because all the experiences show that if you have 10 metrics, you confuse the hell out of it, because life isn't linear and simple. 10 metrics will confuse and confound because they won't all match up together. You won't get them neatly aligned. They'll all be like, one's over there and they, oh, God, that'll make sense of all that stuff. 5, you're much more likely to get a degree of, you know, of triangulation, at least 3 of them. So that's my view. So.
Yeah, it's a fascinating world about what to choose and what to stay with. And I think your point about sharing is interesting, because obviously it's hard to quantify, but people sharing their experiences and bringing in other users is very powerful. Yeah, thank you again.
Good stuff.
Well, look, I think we're pretty much out of time, and I will do thank yous in a moment. I'm going to do a quick shout out for what's coming up. Next Wednesday, we've got our AGM. We're doing our level best to make it entertaining and worth turning up for. So if you haven't RSVP'd yet, please do. Next Wednesday, 3:45 till 5 on Zoom. Then on the 8th of July, we've got the Models of Thinking course, which is an opportunity to engage with all sorts of different ways of thinking about the data that we produce and what we do with it. So that's going to be fascinating. And then, Kate, when's the And More session?
It's lunchtime, 1 p.m. on the 2nd of July.
That's right, yeah, so it's before the Models of Thinking. So for anybody who is it under 26, there is an opportunity to go to the And More lunchtime session. Check out the website for more. Paul, thank you so much again. These are such great sessions. I think, you know, just the conversation afterwards is really helpful as well. Thank you for doing all the hard work so we don't have to. Yeah, thank you very much. We hope to have you back here again.
Yeah, and I think one of the other things we talked about is, you know, this should be an open session. So if any of you have read any cracking good books and you want to do a, you know, it doesn't need to be as long as this, you know, 10-minute, oh, I thought that was a really good book, then I think that's something that we can all learn from. You know, this is how it first started. I was doing the MBA, and basically we all split into study groups, said, well, I'll read the Porter book, you go and read the handy book, that we did that. So that's how it all came about. So let's share any great books.
Yeah, are you saying we can pivot the format?
Oh, absolutely. Why not?
Test and learn, guys, test and learn.
Yeah.
Thank you all so much. Pleasure to see you all. Have a marvelous rest of the day. And Paul, thank you again.
Brilliant. You take care. Cheers, folks. Everyone.
Bye.
Bye.